based on a true story. 30 seconds. That is all it took to create the most famous gunfight in American history. 3 men died, 3 more were wounded, and for over 140 years, historians still argue about who fired first. This is the true story of the gunfight at the OK Corral. Before that half-minute of gunfire, 2 families and 2 ways of life had been building toward collision for nearly 2 years. What happened on Fremont Street would outlive every man who survived it, becoming the single image most people picture when they imagine the American frontier. Tombstone, Arizona Territory, existed because of silver. In 1877, prospector Ed Schieffelin found one of the richest veins of ore ever discovered in the region. Soldiers had warned him he'd find nothing out there but his own tombstone. He named his mine exactly that, and the boomtown that grew around it kept the name. Word of the strike spread fast across the territory, drawing fortune seekers from every direction within months. Tent camps became boarding houses. Boarding houses became saloons, banks, and theaters, rising almost overnight from bare desert scrub. By 1881, Tombstone had swelled with fortune hunters, gamblers, and businessmen chasing silver money. The town supported multiple newspapers, a bowling alley, an ice house, and an opera house, luxuries few frontier towns that size could ever claim to offer. Northern investors and lawmen controlled the town itself. Southern ranchers and cattlemen, many of them former Confederates, controlled the open range surrounding it. The divide ran deeper than simple business rivalry, carrying old wounds from a war barely over a decade behind them. Cattle rustling and stagecoach robbery plagued the roads leading in and out of Tombstone. Most of it blamed on a loosely organized group locals, simply called the Cowboys. Merchants and lawmen in town increasingly saw that faction as a threat to Tombstone's growing respectability and commerce. Both sides brought old resentments into new territory. It would not stay peaceful for long. Newspapers of the era, particularly the Tombstone Epitaph and the Tombstone Nugget, openly took sides in the growing divide, one favoring the Earps and town business interests, the other more sympathetic toward the ranchers and cowboys surrounding the settlement. Readers across the territory followed the rivalry closely, unaware how quickly words in print would give way to gunfire in the street. Wyatt Earp came to Tombstone in 1879, looking for opportunity rather than trouble. He arrived with his wife, his brothers, and ambitions that had little to do with wearing a badge. He hoped to invest in mining claims and gambling establishments, viewing Tombstone's silver boom as a chance to finally build lasting wealth after years of drifting between rougher frontier towns. He had worked as a lawman in rougher towns before, controlled and calculating in ways that unsettled men who preferred chaos. Wyatt believed in order, in the law's authority over a frontier that often ignored both. Colleagues from his earlier lawman days described him as unusually calm under pressure, rarely raising his voice even when situations demanded immediate, decisive action. His brothers Virgil and Morgan followed him to Tombstone soon after. Virgil eventually became town marshal, placing all 3 brothers directly at the center of the town's growing tension between lawmen and the ranchers who resented their authority. The Earp brothers invested together in property, gambling concessions, and mining claims, building a modest fortune alongside their reputations as steady, capable lawmen. Their growing influence in Tombstone's business and civic affairs made them natural targets for resentment among ranchers, who felt increasingly squeezed by northern money and northern law. Wyatt made enemies quickly among a loose group of outlaw cowboys, accused of rustling cattle and robbing stagecoaches across the territory. Some of those same cowboys resented Wyatt personally, believing he had used his position to interfere with profitable arrangements they had long enjoyed unchecked. Wyatt's own ambitions toward higher office, including a rumored interest in running for county sheriff, only deepened cowboy resentment further. A lawman with political ambitions represented, to men already suspicious of northern influence, one more example of Tombstone's establishment closing in around them. John Henry Holliday, known to nearly everyone as Doc, had once been a respected dentist in Georgia. He trained at the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery, building a modest but respectable practice back home before illness changed the entire trajectory of his life. Few who knew him as a young dentist would have predicted the reputation he eventually built out west. Tuberculosis changed everything. Doctors gave him only months to live when he first moved west, chasing drier air that might slow the disease consuming his lungs. He traveled through Texas, Colorado, and Kansas, gambling for a living, since his dental practice could no longer sustain him through worsening bouts of illness. Instead, Doc found gambling tables, whiskey, and a reputation as one of the deadliest men with a pistol in the territory. His temper, quick and unpredictable, combined dangerously with a skill for cards and a willingness to draw a weapon that few gamblers of that era matched. He met Wyatt Earp in Texas years before Tombstone, and the friendship between them ran deeper than either man ever fully explained. Their bond survived years of separate travels, reuniting whenever their paths crossed again across the shifting frontier. Wyatt later told a reporter plainly, without Holliday's help, he believed he would not have survived that October night at all. Bat Masterson, another lawman who knew them both, once said Doc's whole heart belonged to Wyatt, and that he was always ready to risk his life defending any cause Wyatt believed in. By 1881, Doc's illness had visibly worsened, his frame thin and his coughing fits impossible to hide during long nights at the card tables. Few expected him to live many more years, regardless of the violence gathering around Tombstone that autumn. Despite his declining health, Doc remained quick-tempered and fiercely loyal, traits that made him both respected and feared throughout the territory. Those who gambled against him learned quickly that his failing lungs had done nothing to slow his reflexes or dull his aim. Tension between the Earps and the Cowboy faction built for nearly 2 years before it finally exploded. The Clanton and McClory families ran cattle outside Tombstone, and lawmen suspected both families of rustling stock and robbing Wells Fargo stagecoaches passing through the territory. Their ranches sat close enough to the Mexican border that stolen cattle could disappear across it easily, complicating any effort to prove formal charges against them. Ike Clanton, older brother to Billy, grew especially vocal in his hatred of the Earps, drinking heavily and making threats no one in town took entirely seriously. His temper worsened considerably after he secretly agreed to inform Wyatt about stagecoach robbers in exchange for reward money, a deal Ike feared desperately would become public knowledge among his own associates. That fear, more than any single insult, seemed to drive much of Ike's mounting paranoia through the summer and autumn of 1881. He grew convinced the Earps intended to expose him regardless of their actual intentions, and that conviction hardened into open hostility as the year wore on. Until the night before the gunfight, when Ike's threats turned specific and public, he drank through much of the night at the Alhambra saloon, growing louder and more specific with every round, telling anyone who would listen that the Earps and Doc Holliday would not live to see another sunset. Witnesses later recalled the threats clearly enough to repeat them nearly word for word during the trial that followed weeks later. Virgil Earp, as town marshal, could no longer treat the threats as empty noise. The morning of October 26, 1881, brought no relief from the tension building since the night before. Ike Clanton wandered Tombstone armed and drunk, still muttering threats against the Earps in front of witnesses. He carried both a rifle and a pistol openly through the streets, violating Tombstone's ordinance against carrying firearms within town limits, a law the Earps themselves had helped establish and enforce. Virgil confronted him directly, disarming him with a pistol whip rather than a bullet, a small act of restraint that cooled nothing beneath the surface. Ike was fined for the violation and released, still furious, still convinced the Earps intended him personal harm, regardless of the law's involvement. Wyatt encountered Ike again shortly afterward on the street, and a brief, heated exchange followed, witnesses recalling raised voices though no violence at that particular moment. Both men parted ways, still simmering, the morning's tension doing nothing to diffuse what had been building for months. Reports reached Virgil that Ike's brother Billy, along with Tom and Frank McClory and Billy Claiborne, had gathered near a vacant lot behind the OK Corral on Fremont Street, all of them armed in direct violation of Tombstone's ordinance against carrying firearms within town limits. Concerned townsfolk approached Virgil directly, warning him the Cowboys appeared ready for serious trouble rather than simple drunken bluster. Several witnesses later testified they believed a violent confrontation seemed inevitable well before the Earps ever approached Fremont Street themselves. Virgil made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would walk down Fremont Street with his brothers and Doc Holliday, and he would disarm those men himself. Virgil, Wyatt, Morgan, and Doc Holliday walked together toward the vacant lot near Fremont Street shortly after 3 in the afternoon. The 4 men crossed several blocks of town in plain view, watched by dozens of onlookers who understood immediately something serious was about to unfold. Shopkeepers stepped into doorways. Conversations on the boardwalk fell silent as the group passed. Doc Holliday carried a shotgun that afternoon, concealed beneath his long coat, a detail witnesses would argue about for decades afterward when reconstructing exactly how the confrontation began. Virgil, as the officer in charge, carried a cane rather than drawing his weapon immediately, signaling his intent to demand surrender rather than provoke violence outright. Witnesses later disagreed sharply about what happened in the moments before shots rang out. Some claimed the Cowboys raised their hands in surrender. Others swore Billy Clanton and Frank McClory reached for their weapons the instant the lawmen arrived. The narrow, vacant lot left little room for maneuvering, horses and buildings crowding the space, where 6 armed men now faced each other at a distance close enough to guarantee any gunfire would prove devastating. Virgil shouted for the men to throw up their hands and surrender their arms. What happened in the next several seconds would be argued in courtrooms, newspapers, and history books for the rest of the following century. Virgil Earp had every legal right to walk away from that confrontation and wait for cooler heads to prevail. He could have waited for the Cowboys to disperse on their own, avoiding direct confrontation entirely and risking only further threats rather than immediate violence. Many lawmen in his position might have chosen exactly that caution, preferring delay over the certainty of gunfire in a crowded public street. He chose instead to enforce Tombstone's law directly, believing a marshal who ignored armed men in his own town invited far greater violence later. Virgil had built his entire reputation on consistent, visible enforcement, and backing down from an open threat risked undermining the very authority his badge represented. Doc Holliday, sick and unlikely to live many more years regardless of that afternoon's outcome, chose to walk beside his friend anyway, unwilling to let Wyatt face armed men without him. His illness alone might have excused him from the confrontation entirely, yet loyalty outweighed whatever caution his failing health might otherwise have demanded. Neither man was required to make that choice. Both made it within seconds of each other, without a single word passed between them confirming the decision. Wyatt later described that unspoken understanding as one of the defining qualities of his friendship with Holliday, a trust built through years of shared danger across multiple frontier towns. The first shots erupted almost simultaneously, and confusion swallowed Fremont Street within instants. Billy Clanton and Frank McClory both fired quickly, and the exchange that followed became one of the most studied 30 seconds in American history. Bullets tore through the narrow lot, ricocheting off wooden buildings, sending bystanders scrambling for any cover they could find within reach. Doc Holliday fired his shotgun into Tom McClory, killing him almost instantly. The blast, delivered at close range, ended the confrontation for one of the 6 men, before he ever managed to return effective fire of his own. Morgan and Wyatt Earp exchanged fire with Billy Clanton and Frank McClory, wounding and eventually killing both men in the chaos. Billy Clanton, only 19 years old, continued firing even after being struck multiple times, refusing to surrender until his wounds finally overcame him entirely. Virgil Earp took a bullet through the calf, staggering but refusing to leave the fight, continuing to direct his brothers even as blood soaked through his boot. Morgan Earp was struck across the back, the wound shallow but agonizing, momentarily dropping him before he rose again to continue firing. Doc Holliday suffered a graze wound to his hip, staying upright and firing throughout, his failing health apparently no match for the adrenaline driving him through those final desperate seconds. Ike Clanton, unarmed by his own later claim, fled the lot entirely before the worst of the gunfire began, ducking into a nearby building and escaping largely unharmed by circumstances he had done much to provoke. Billy Claiborne ran as well, leaving his companions to face the Earps and Holliday alone. When the smoke cleared 30 seconds later, Billy Clanton, Tom McClory, and Frank McClory lay dead or dying in the dirt. The street fell into stunned silence immediately afterward, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the shocked murmurs of townsfolk who had watched the entire encounter unfold from doorways and windows along Fremont Street. Doctors arrived within minutes, tending to Virgil and Morgan's wounds, while townsfolk carried the 3 dead cowboys away for burial preparations. News of the gunfight spread through Tombstone within the hour, and by nightfall, telegraph wires carried the story to newspapers across the territory and beyond. A month-long murder trial followed, examining whether the Earps and Holliday had committed murder or acted in lawful self-defense. Prosecutors argued the Cowboys had attempted to surrender before being gunned down without cause. The defense countered that Billy Clanton and Frank McClory had drawn their weapons first, leaving the Earps and Holliday no reasonable choice but to return fire in self-defense. Judge Wells Spicer ultimately ruled in the Earps' favor, finding insufficient evidence to convict any of the 4 men involved. His written opinion carefully weighed conflicting testimony, ultimately concluding the lawmen had acted within their legal authority under genuinely dangerous circumstances. The ruling did not end the violence. Ike Clanton and his allies pursued a vendetta against the Earp family for years afterward, ambushing and crippling Virgil permanently, then assassinating Morgan Earp outright in December 1882. Virgil never fully recovered use of his left arm, carrying the physical cost of that vendetta for the rest of his life. Wyatt Earp, grieving and furious, led his own retaliatory campaign through the territory, before eventually settling into a quieter, longer life far from Tombstone. That campaign, later known as the Earp Vendetta Ride, pursued the men Wyatt believed responsible for his brother's murder across the territory for weeks before finally ending. He died in Los Angeles in January 1929, largely unknown to the wider public until author Stuart Lake published a biography 2 years after his death, turning Wyatt Earp into a national legend almost overnight. The book's success sparked decades of films, television shows, and popular retellings, cementing the 30-second gunfight as one of America's most enduring frontier legends. Ike Clanton himself never faced justice for the years of violence he stirred. A detective shot him dead in 1887, 6 years after he first ran from the gunfight, that made his family's name infamous, closing the final chapter on a feud that had already cost so many lives. Doc Holliday's own health finally failed him in 1887 as well, dying of tuberculosis in a Colorado sanatorium, reportedly remarking with dark humor that dying without his boots on was somehow unexpected after the life he had lived. Today, Tombstone stages the gunfight at the OK, Corral 4 times daily for tourists who travel from across the world to watch 30 seconds of history repeat itself over and over, exactly as it happened that October afternoon in 1881. The town itself, once a booming silver camp on the edge of collapse, survives today largely because of that single afternoon. Its economy built almost entirely around visitors eager to stand on the same ground where 6 armed men once decided, in half a minute, how American history would remember them. Historians continue debating fine details of that afternoon even now, poring over decades-old testimony, newspaper accounts, and forensic analysis in hopes of settling questions the original trial never fully resolved. Few 30-second events in American history have generated so much sustained scholarly and popular fascination, a testament to how completely that single gunfight came to symbolize the entire mythology of the American frontier. The end.